Hi, welcome to week 3 of Presentation Power. Before we get started, let's review last week's homework, which was Dr. Maitha Alhassan's talk on Real to Represented, which was asking us to look at the recurring harmful narratives in America. So some of you thought that this was an informational talk, and while she did use lots of information, it actually was a persuasive talk. We know it's persuasive when they are asking the audience to do something. So if the end goal is to ask your audience to change their view or to move you to any kind of action, then it is a persuasive talk. Usually we think of sales talks as being persuasive, which leads us to this week's talk, which is how to gain trust, ethics, and credibility when we're talking. Now, we know you need to consider your audience before you even get started, before you even begin your outline. Look at the demographics and psychographics. But this week, let's look at how we can look at some fundamental practices for building trusts. You're going to read about how you can use body language to gain credibility, as well as how you can use inclusive language to build an inclusive environment. So to build trust through our body language, Mark Bowden, who's a great video, I'm excited for you haven't watched it yet, I'm really excited to think you're going to love it. He reminds us that simple things we can do, like smiling or using open body language, keeping our gestures consistent, can help build our credibility when we walk on stage. Dr. Alhassan, some of you pointed out that you felt that her gestures started getting erratic or flailing when she got nervous because the slides weren't working. And if you were an audience member that was already not believing what she was talking, or maybe you weren't on board with her message, you would probably start to doubt her credibility or start turning off, stop listening to her, because her body language her gestures no longer become consistent. What does it mean when we say ethical? This is a great ethical diagram or theory that Elizabeth Tilley, who's the public communications expert from Massey University, she designed this pyramid for public relations practitioners so they could look at the ethics of every part of the campaign when they were building a campaign. But we can use it also for public speaking. When we look at the bottom part of the pyramid, what is our intent? What is the intent of this talk? If we all agree that being honest is being ethical, if we are not honest in our talk, then we're being unethical. And that sounds sort of like a duh, but that honesty is ethical, being ethical. But a lot of times you hear talks where people intentionally use false information. The means are what methods are we employing to do this talk? What are the tools? What are the behaviors that we are using to achieve our desired outcome? So are we telling our audience some false information because we want them to do something? Are we knowingly talking, for example, are we knowingly talking to an audience that we know cannot afford to donate, but yet we're going to give them a message that's going to make them feel compelled to? Well, you shouldn't be talking to that audience. You should find a different audience, one that you know that would have the funding. So you don't want to use the wrong means. Where are you doing this? And then finally, the end. What is your desired outcome? If you are asking for money, is that money going to be used the way you say it's going to be used? Or perhaps you're using the money elsewhere? And again, these are all sort of really big issues, but we need to consider for every part of our speech, from what audience we're talking to, for what our subject is, what language we're using. All of this makes up the ethics of our talk. And you're going to read more about different aspects of ethics when you are giving a talk, and that's actually what of our discussion this week. But one of the things I want to point out is references and citations, because this is somewhere with a lot of students I've worked with, seems to sort of be a sticking point. So you're out, if you're preparing your talk and you're creating an outline, we're going to talk about structure later, but you don't talk the same way that you write. Your language is structured differently. So, but like writing, you do need to provide references. We need to cite references. But when? So if something is universal knowledge, it does not need to be cited or referenced. If I'm telling you that the sun is a star or the earth is round, or something like COVID vaccines greatly reduce the rate of serious illness or death. This is pretty much undebatable. If you look at all the numbers out there, every headline, we know this. Or you could say many Americans will not have saved enough money to live on when they retire. Again, depending on the audience you're talking to, this is common knowledge. If you're talking to high school students, it's not common knowledge. But this is a broad enough statement that you don't need to reference it. Now, if we say something more specific, you do need to reference and cite it. And these are ways for us to ensure that we maintain our credibility. So if I was going to talk to you about long-term COVID and said something like 18% of people who had COVID developed symptoms, well, that's really specific. And I'm not sure as an audience member, how do you know that? Well, the way I would say that is a 2021 UK study estimated that up to 18% of people who had COVID developed symptoms of long-term COVID. And I would cite that on my slide. Same thing with retirement. I could say a Boston College study found that 36% of Americans ages 65 to 39 aren't able to cover 1 year of minimal care when they retire. And I would cite it on my slide. What resources do retirees have to long-term services and support to 2021 study? So if you're saying something that isn't common knowledge, or if it is specific, the same with when you're quoting someone. If you are quoting someone, say, as Seinfeld says, people are more afraid of public speaking than death. Next, we're going to talk about, read about inclusive language. Language is extremely powerful, right? Whether we can consciously or unconsciously offend people. So it's a way to include people, it's a way to exclude people. So we have to be really conscientious when we are designing our talk and we're talking to different audiences. Some of the principles of inclusive language are using people-centric language, referencing personal attributes when relevant to the context, not making assumptions, being conscious of the implications of the language that you're using, and also working hard to remove stereotypes and myths. So these are some of the things that we can do. And I've got a great guide. I've got a couple resources that I use. One of them is called the Conscious Style Guide. And this was written by, or put together by Karen Yin, who is a writer and editor behind AP versus Chicago and the Editors of Color database. And this is one of the guides that the Poynter Institute, which is one of the top institutes for journalists, for training journalists. This is one of the guides that they mention that we should look for when we're looking for compassionate, empowering, mindful, inclusive language. So I've got a QR code there. You can take a picture of it and go directly to the guide. Another thing that I love, it's called the Radical Copy Editor. And again, I've got the QR code there. And if you see on the top right, I've got the URL. So you can either type that in, the Radical Copy Editor. And this is another great resource for looking about like using first person language. Here, do I use adjective diverse? So another great resource if you're trying to make sure or check and see, is the language you're using inclusive? And finally, I think the last article I have you read is about framing and use of metaphors. So metaphors serve as a great tool for breaking down complex concepts into more digestible statements. Metaphors can really get your audience interested if you can connect to something that they know. If you're talking to an audience and you know there's people in there that are woodworkers, whatever the subject is, you can make analogies about woodworking and sawing and use some of the terminology that they use. So metaphors are basically figures of speech that compare two things, people, ideas, by stating that one is the other, right? The two are not similar, of course. So all the world is not a stage, as Shakespeare says, but we're like, oh, I know what the world, the stage, and we know what he's implying with that metaphor. So brain research has found that metaphor language is very emotionally engaging. And this was through two professors, Dr. Citron and Dr. Goldberg in 2014. They found if we use language like she is sweet versus she is kind, they each have, because sweet is a metaphor for candy, we actually have a different emotional reaction than if we hear she is kind. So in your talk, if you're trying to if you have abstract terms and you want your audience to understand it better, this is a great way to make really complex data and unknown ideas feel more tangible to your audience. Metaphors engage your audience and give them that something to relate for. Something to relate to. And they can also be used as a persuasive device. Martin Luther King's speech on the Mall, the I Have a Dream speech, he uses metaphors like the vast ocean of prosperity or the lonely island of poverty. metaphors not only lend to rhetorical power, but depending on which ones you choose, they can speak to the values and the strategy of your organization. Sometimes metaphors actually give a bad intention and have an opposite effect of what you are hoping for. So, for example, there was a study done on war metaphors, and that using that when talking about cancer with patients. So using things like fighting against your disease or winning the battle. And a 2017 study found looking at violence and journey with patients, with cancer patients, found that people perceive treatment to be more difficult when it's described as a war rather than using other terminology. And so you might actually be backfiring. You think that you're helping your patient, we're going to fight this battle together. What if they start losing the battle and then they can feel defeated? They may not feel up to fighting. So perhaps looking at, really thoughtfully about the metaphors that you're choosing, and are you empowering your audience, or are you actually making them feel less powerful? So metaphors are something that we should consider when we are using inclusive language. For your homework, you've got two things. You've got a discussion and your first presentation. So for the discussion, we're talking about ethics. And after you've read everything about ethics, I want to know which of the ones do you think is most important in ethical speaking? And is that plagiarism? Like, there's a list in there of the different ways that we can make sure that we are ethical in our speech. So what's the most important? What's the second most? And what's the third? And why do you pick that order? Which one do you think why did you think one was more important than the other? And the second thing you're doing is you're giving a presentation. This is your commencement, birthday, or awards program. You get to choose. Remember, when we're writing these speeches, I do not want you to write a script. I want you just to do it as bullet points, because otherwise it will end up sounding like a script. So think about that. Think of everything you know about audience, what you've learned so far about being ethical, about considering your audience, who's out there, and then choose some sort of ceremonial speech that you can give and record yourself either on Zoom or whatever software platform you like the best. And you can upload that. I've got it open so you can do Zoom, you can upload an MP4 file. So again, whatever works best for you.